Jake was just an ordinary man, a bodyguard by profession, who never expected his life would change so drastically. A chance encounter led him to a new assignment that would alter the course of his life forever. It all began when Jake received an unexpected call. A wealthy client, representing an intergalactic corporation, had an offer that was too good to ignore. The job: protect two alien women, Lyra and Zara, twin sisters from a distant galaxy. They were rare and valuable to the corporation, and their safety was a top priority. The pay was astronomical, a sum that could set him up for life. But there was one catch. Jake didn't know much about the aliens, their origins, or why they needed such protection. Jake hesitated for a moment, but the offer was hard to resist. He was a skilled bodyguard, capable of handling any situation. The excitement of working for a prestigious client, not to mention the hefty paycheck, was too much to turn down. Without much thought, Jake accepted the job. The first meeting with Lyra and Zara was nothing like he expected. They weren't what he had imagined, cold, distant creatures. Instead, the twins were strikingly beautiful with mesmerizing, alien features. Lyra's skin shimmered with a soft, silver hue, while Zara's eyes glowed with a deep violet light. Their presence was commanding, yet they carried an aura of mystery that Jake couldn't ignore. It was clear from the start that they weren't just any ordinary beings. They were important, powerful, and highly sought after. Despite their otherworldly appearance, the twins were surprisingly kind and welcoming. They spoke in a calm, measured tone, explaining that their lives had been threatened for some time. Enemies who wanted to exploit their unique abilities were closing in, and they had no choice but to trust Jake. As they briefed him on the job, Jake's curiosity grew. What kind of abilities did they possess? Why were they so valuable? But no matter how many questions he had, the twins only offered cryptic answers. The job sounded straightforward. Stay by their side, protect them from harm, and keep them hidden from those who wish to do them harm. However, something about the entire situation felt off. The more Jake learned about the twins, the more questions piled up. Why had they been running from danger for so long? And why did they need a human bodyguard in the first place? As the days passed, Jake found himself growing more curious and even protective of the twins. They weren't just clients to him anymore. There was something about their bond that intrigued him, something that made him feel like part of their world. But as much as he tried to focus on his mission, the tension between them was undeniable. He couldn't help but feel drawn to them, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this job than he was being told. Little did Jake know, this mission was only the beginning of a journey that would take him far beyond anything he had ever imagined. Jake wasn't sure what to expect when he first laid eyes on Lyra and Zara. He had heard the stories, how alien beings could be mysterious, dangerous, and cold. But the twins didn't fit any of those descriptions. From the moment he entered the room where they were waiting, he felt a strange pull. The air around them seemed to shimmer, and their presence was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Lyra stood near the window, her silver skin glowing softly under the light. She looked graceful and calm, her violet eyes staring out at the cityscape. Zara, on the other hand, was more playful in her demeanor. Her deep blue hair cascaded down her back, and her green eyes were bright with energy. Despite their differences, there was something undeniably powerful about both of them. As if they were more than just aliens. They were forces to be reckoned with. "Jake," Lyra said, her voice smooth and melodic, "it's good to finally meet you." Her words were precise, as if carefully chosen, yet warm. Zara gave him a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She was sizing him up, studying him as if trying to figure out exactly who this human was who would be protecting them. Jake nodded, still unsure of what to make of the situation. "I'm here to protect you. Whatever you need, I'll make sure you're safe." The twins exchanged a look before Lyra spoke again. "We are not like the others you've protected before. Our enemies are different. This mission will not be simple." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had been bodyguarding for years, but he had never been warned like this. Most clients simply hired him for his skills, never mentioning the dangers so directly. But there was something about Lyra's tone that made him take her seriously. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him this job was far from ordinary. For the next few hours, Jake sat with the twins as they briefed him on their past and the enemies who had been hunting them for years. Their story was nothing short of extraordinary. Lyra and Zara weren't just from another planet. They were part of a powerful royal family, and their abilities were unlike anything Jake had ever heard of. They didn't just have advanced technology. They could manipulate energy, control the environment around them, and even influence the emotions of those they came in contact with. This wasn't just about keeping them safe from attackers. It was about protecting them from forces far more powerful than anything Jake had ever encountered. The more they spoke, the more intrigued Jake became. He had only signed up for the job for the money, but now he found himself deeply invested in their well-being. There was something about Lyra's calm confidence and Zara's fierce energy that made him feel protective. He had to admit, he wasn't just guarding them out of duty. He was beginning to care about them. As the day ended and Jake prepared to leave for the night, Zara gave him a long, intense look. "You're not like the others," she said quietly, her voice low. "I hope you prove us right." Jake didn't know what that meant, but the words stuck with him. There was more to these twins than he had been told, and he was determined to find out what it was. Little did he know, his role in their lives would soon evolve into something far more complicated than a simple bodyguard mission. Jake had only been on the job for a few days, but already he could tell something was off. Protecting Lyra and Zara was not going to be as simple as he thought. There was danger everywhere, and it wasn't just the obvious kind. The twins were always on edge, their eyes darting around every room they entered, as if expecting an attack at any moment. The first sign came that evening. After a quiet dinner at their private residence, Jake escorted the twins to their room, staying on high alert. His instincts told him that something wasn't right, but there was no visible threat. That's when it happened. A loud crash echoed through the hallway, followed by the sharp sound of footsteps. Jake's heart raced as he moved into defensive position, pulling his gun from its holster. Lyra and Zara froze, their eyes wide with fear. They didn't seem startled by the sound. It was as if they had been waiting for it. Jake barely had time to react before a group of masked figures appeared at the door. They moved with quick precision, aiming their weapons at the twins. Jake didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, knocking one of them to the ground. The fight was fast, chaotic, and violent. Jake was skilled, but the attackers were trained too. His heart raced as he tried to fight them off, protecting the twins with every move. In the middle of the struggle, Jake glanced over at Lyra and Zara. They weren't just standing there in fear. They were focused, their eyes glowing faintly as they raised their hands. The attackers hesitated, unsure of what to do next. That's when Jake realized something important. The twins weren't helpless. They had power that went far beyond what any human could comprehend. Zara's voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding. "Step back, Jake. We can handle this." But Jake wasn't about to let them fight alone. He grabbed one of the attackers, slamming him into the wall, knocking the wind out of him. The fight continued, but it was clear that the twins were more than capable of defending themselves. Lyra's hands glowed brighter now, sending pulses of energy that sent attackers flying. Within minutes, the intruders were knocked out cold, their weapons scattered across the floor. Jake stood, breathing heavily, but his focus never wavered. He looked at the twins, both of them looking unaffected, as if the attack had been just another part of their routine. "Are you all right?" Jake asked, his voice full of concern. Lyra nodded, but Zara was staring at him with an unreadable expression. "You did well," Lyra said, her voice still calm. "But this is far from over." Jake's mind raced. He thought he was protecting them from a simple group of assassins, But now he realized the threat was much bigger. These weren't ordinary attackers. They were trained and organized, and someone out there was willing to go to extreme lengths to get to the twins. And no matter how powerful the sisters were, Jake knew he couldn't protect them alone. "Who's after you?" Jake asked, his voice shaking slightly. "What is going on?" Lyra and Zara exchanged a look before Lyra answered. "We are being hunted by those who want to use our abilities for their own gain. We are more than just valuable. Our very existence is a threat to some people." Jake's mind spun with the new information. The twins weren't just in danger. They were the key to something far larger than he could ever have imagined. And as the weight of the situation settled in, Jake realized one thing for sure. His job had just become a lot more complicated. The night after the attack was eerily quiet. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Jake couldn't shake the tension that hung in the air. He sat alone in the living room, his thoughts racing. The fight had left him shaken, and as he replayed the events in his mind, it became clear that this was just the beginning. Whoever was after Lyra and Zara wasn't going to stop. The twins weren't just targets. They were being hunted by something much bigger than a group of mercenaries. Jake had always been good at his job, but this was different. His usual training didn't prepare him for the kind of danger these twins were facing. Their abilities were beyond anything he'd ever seen, and yet they were still at risk. It was as if they were trapped in a never-ending game of cat and mouse, and no matter how well they fought back, the enemy would always find a way to catch up. As Jake sat there, staring into the darkness, he heard footsteps approaching. He stood quickly, instinctively reaching for his weapon, but it was only Lyra. Her silver skin glowed faintly in the dim light, and her eyes, though calm, held a hint of concern. "Jake," she said softly, her voice a soothing contrast to the tension that had built up over the past few hours. "You don't need to worry. We can handle ourselves." Jake shook his head, his frustration evident. "That's not the point. I'm here to protect you, but it feels like we're sitting ducks. I can't keep you safe if we're just waiting for the next attack." Lyra stepped closer, her expression softening. "You've done more than enough, but I know this is hard for you. We understand the danger, and we are prepared. You just need to trust us a little more." Zara appeared behind her, her eyes scanning the room with the same intensity as always. The attackers weren't just mercenaries. They were sent by someone close to us, someone we've been running from for a long time. Jake frowned, confused. "Who would want to hurt you? You're not just any ordinary aliens." Zara's gaze hardened. "We're not just any aliens, no. Our people possess abilities that others covet. Abilities that could change the balance of power across entire galaxies. Some want to control us, others want to eliminate us. Either way, we are a threat to their plans." Jake's mind raced with the new information. He had always known the job wasn't simple, but this was bigger than anything he had imagined. Lyra and Zara weren't just people in danger. They were the key to something larger, something that could shake the very foundations of the universe. Before he could ask more questions, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house. The sound of shuffling feet followed, and within moments, the door to the living room burst open. Jake's heart pounded as he rushed to the door, his hand gripping his weapon tightly. But before he could react, Lyra raised her hand, and the room seemed to freeze. A wave of energy radiated from her, pushing the intruders back, as if they were nothing more than paper dolls. Zara's voice was calm but firm. "I told you, Jake. We don't need saving." As the last intruder crumpled to the floor, Jake stood there, stunned. The twins weren't just capable of defending themselves, they were unstoppable. But even as he realized their power, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all on borrowed time. Jake had always been focused on the mission. He was a bodyguard, trained to protect his clients, no matter who they were. But as the days passed, something changed. His thoughts kept drifting back to Lyra and Zara. They weren't just his clients anymore. They had become something more, something he couldn't quite define. Lyra's calmness and wisdom fascinated him. She spoke with a quiet confidence, her words often carrying an unspoken depth that Jake couldn't fully grasp. Zara, on the other hand, was fiery and unpredictable. Her energy seemed to fill the room, and her quick wit often kept Jake on his toes. They were opposites in many ways, but there was a connection between them that was impossible to ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake found himself sitting across from the twins in their private quarters. The usual tension was still there, but tonight it felt different. There was an unspoken understanding between them, as if they had all begun to trust each other in ways they hadn't before. Lyra was the first to speak. "Jake, I know you didn't sign up for this. You came here to do a job, and that job is dangerous. But we want you to know something. We're not just using you as a bodyguard. We trust you." Jake wasn't sure how to respond. He had been hired for protection, and while he had formed a bond with them, it was still a professional one in his mind. But as he looked at the twins, something inside him shifted. He had never been one to let his emotions cloud his work, but this was different. The way they spoke to him, the way they looked at him, it made him feel like he was more than just a hired hand. He felt like part of something bigger. Zara leaned forward, her eyes locking with Jake's. "We didn't expect you to care for us. But you've done more than protect us. You fought beside us, and that means more than you realize." Jake felt a warmth spread through him, and it wasn't just from the compliment. There was something else in Zara's voice, something that made his heart race. He had always been drawn to her fiery spirit, but now he found himself admiring her strength in ways he hadn't before. It wasn't just about the physical attraction. It was the way she looked at him, the way they worked together. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Jake shifted in his seat, unsure of what to say next. He was starting to realize just how deeply he had become involved in their lives. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about them. They had shared parts of themselves with him that no one else knew. And in turn, he had begun to open up to them in ways he never had before. As the night grew darker, they talked more about everything and nothing. Lyra shared stories of her home planet, of a place far beyond the stars, while Zara spoke of the challenges they had faced in their journey. The conversation felt easy, natural, as though they had known each other for much longer than just a few weeks. By the time the night came to an end, Jake realized that he had come to care for the twins in a way he hadn't anticipated. His duty to protect them had turned into something more, something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. And as the night grew quiet around them, Jake knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a bond. The connection between them had only just begun to grow, and Jake wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he was ready to face whatever came next, together. Jake hadn't let his guard down since the night of the attack, but the feeling of unease still lingered. Despite the twins' abilities and the power they held, something about their situation didn't sit right. Every day, it seemed like there was another layer to the story he hadn't been told. His instincts told him that the truth was still hidden somewhere, just out of reach. It wasn't until a late evening that Jake's suspicions were finally confirmed. The twins had asked him to accompany them on a meeting with an ally, a man who, according to them, had been working with them for years. Jake had no reason to doubt their word, but something about the entire situation felt off. The meeting was to take place at a remote location, away from the safety of their base, and Jake was uneasy about it. As they drove in the sleek black vehicle, Zora's restless energy filled the space. She kept glancing out the windows, scanning their surroundings, her eyes sharp and calculating. Lyra, on the other hand, was quieter than usual. She had always been calm and composed, but tonight, even her usually steady gaze seemed to flicker with unease. "We don't trust anyone outside of this circle, Jake," Lyra said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "But sometimes we have to take risks to survive." Jake glanced at her, trying to read her expression. He didn't like the way she said it, as if she was trying to reassure him. or maybe herself. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, a sudden loud noise shattered the calm. Tires screeched as the vehicle swerved violently to one side. In an instant, they were surrounded by a group of armed men, their weapons drawn and pointed directly at the car. "Stay down," Jake shouted, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. He instinctively shielded Lyra and Zara, pulling them both close to him. His heart raced as he scanned the surroundings. It was clear this wasn't just another random attack. It was carefully orchestrated. Before he could act, the vehicle's door was torn open, and a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was the man they had been meeting with, his face twisted in a cruel smirk. Jake's heart sank as the truth hit him like a punch in the stomach. "You," Jake growled, barely able to keep his voice steady. "You betrayed us." The man laughed softly, his eyes glinting with malice. "It wasn't personal, but your value was just too much to pass up." He turned to the twins, his gaze cold. "You were always the prize. It's just time to collect." Jake's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. The man wasn't just an ally. He was working with the same enemies who had been hunting the twins. He had played them all along. This was a setup, and now, the twins were in even greater danger than before. Zara's voice broke through the tension. "No one betrays us," she hissed, her eyes blazing with fury. With a wave of her hand, the air seemed to vibrate, and the armed men surrounding them staggered back as if hit by an invisible force. But the damage was already done. The betrayal had shattered their fragile trust, and Jake realized that the stakes had grown much higher. The twins were no longer just in danger. They were the target of a far-reaching conspiracy. And now he was too. As the dust settled, and the vehicle drove off with the man in the lead, Jake was left with a sinking feeling in his gut. The twins had always known they were in danger, but now, the danger was much closer, and much more personal. Jake's role had just changed. He wasn't just a bodyguard anymore. He was in this fight, whether he wanted to be or not. Jake's heart raced as the betrayal sank in. The man they had trusted, the one who had been feeding them information, was now the one responsible for putting their lives in jeopardy. Everything they had worked for, every plan they had made, seemed to have fallen apart in the blink of an eye. But there was no time to dwell on it. The danger was real, and it was closing in fast. The twins, shaken but resolute, knew that they had to leave. They couldn't stay in one place any longer. The betrayal had alerted their enemies to their location, and Jake knew that it wouldn't be long before more attacks came. There was no choice but to go on the run. "We have to get to the ship," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "It's our only chance now." Jake nodded, his mind already working through the plan. He had been trained to protect people, but this was different. This wasn't just about defense. It was about survival. He had to get the twins to safety, no matter the cost. Zara, ever the fighter, was already preparing herself for what lay ahead. She had a fire in her that Jake admired, but even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. They had been running for so long, always looking over their shoulders, and Jake could see the toll it had taken on them. They were more than just targets now. They were hunted, and their every move had to be calculated. "Stay close," Jake said, as he took the lead. "I'll get you to the ship, and then we'll figure out what to do from there." The trio moved quickly, slipping through back alleys and side streets to avoid detection. Jake's instincts were on high alert as he scanned their surroundings, looking for any sign of danger. But the streets were empty, too quiet. It was a strange feeling, like the calm before a storm. As they neared the edge of the city, Jake felt a surge of hope. They were almost there. The ship was waiting for them, hidden in the hangar just outside the city limits. It had been their escape plan all along, but Jake had never expected to use it under these circumstances. Just as they reached the entrance of the hangar, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath them. Jake's heart skipped a beat as debris rained down around them. The enemy had found them, and they were closing in fast. "Move," Jake shouted, grabbing Lyra and Zara's arms as he pulled them into the hangar. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang, but the danger was far from over. They had to get to the ship and leave the planet before it was too late. Jake pushed forward, his mind racing through every possible scenario. There was no room for mistakes now. They had to move quickly, or they wouldn't make it out alive. Inside the hangar, the ship sat waiting. It was sleek, advanced, and their ticket to freedom. Jake rushed up the ramp, but as he turned to help the twins, he saw the look in their eyes, the same fear and determination that he felt. They weren't just running away from their enemies. They were fighting for their lives, for a future they had fought too long to protect. With one last glance at the hangar door, Jake sealed it shut behind them. The engines roared to life, and the ship lifted off the ground, soaring into the night sky. As they ascended, Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past days lift off his shoulders. But the fight was far from over. The journey ahead would be even harder. But for the first time since this mission began, Jake felt a flicker of hope. They were alive. They had escaped. And now, together, they would face whatever came next. The stars outside the ship's windows blinked like distant beacons, far away from the chaos they had just escaped. Inside, the silence was almost deafening. Jake sat in the pilot's seat, his hands gripping the controls as the ship soared through the vastness of space. The threat of their enemies still weighed heavily on him, but for the moment, they were safe. At least for now. Lyra and Zara sat quietly across the room, both of them lost in their thoughts. Jake could feel the tension in the air, but there was something more, something unspoken, a bond that had formed between them in the midst of everything. He wasn't sure when it happened, but it had. They were no longer just his clients. They were his responsibility, his friends, maybe even something more. Zara's voice broke the silence, sharp but full of emotion. "I didn't think we'd make it out of there. It felt like everything was collapsing around us." She paused, her gaze meeting Jake's. "But you kept us safe. You didn't hesitate, even when everything was going wrong." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was just doing my job. I'm a bodyguard." Lyra, always the calm one, looked over at him with a soft smile. "You're more than that to us, Jake. You've done more than protect us. You've become part of our fight." Her voice was quiet, but it held a sincerity that struck him deeply. Jake didn't know how to respond. His job had always been about following orders, about protecting his clients and keeping a distance. But with Lyra and Zara, it was different. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing them as just clients and started seeing them as people he truly cared about. He couldn't deny it anymore. They had become important to him, and the bond they shared was something he had never expected. Zara stood up and walked toward him, her eyes locked onto his. There was something in her gaze, something vulnerable and raw. "You don't realize how much you mean to us, do you?" she said, her voice quieter than usual. "We've been through so much, and you've been there every step of the way. You're not just a bodyguard to us anymore, Jake. You're family." Jake swallowed hard, the words hitting him in a way he hadn't anticipated. His emotions were tangled: fear, relief, and something else he couldn't quite name. But as he looked at Zara, then at Lyra, he knew what he felt. They had become a part of his life in a way that was deeper than any job. They had trusted him with their lives, and he had done the same. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake said, his voice steady despite the flood of emotions inside him. "I'll protect you. I'll keep you safe, no matter what." Lyra's eyes softened, and for the first time since the chaos had started, she seemed at peace. "We know, Jake, and we'll do the same for you." Her words were simple, but the meaning behind them was clear. There was a brief moment of quiet between them, and Jake felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if, for the first time in ages, he had found something he wasn't willing to let go of. Zara smiled faintly, her energy shifting to something gentler. "We may be running, but for now, We have each other, and that's enough." Jake nodded, his heart feeling a little lighter. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the danger hadn't passed. But in that moment, he knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The bond between them was unbreakable, and nothing, not even the enemies hunting them, could tear that apart. The stars outside the window seemed to glow a little brighter, as if to remind them that even in the darkest of times, there was hope. And for the first time in a long while, Jake allowed himself to believe in it. The hum of the ship's engine was the only sound as they sped through space. Jake sat in the pilot's seat, his fingers tightly gripping the controls. It had been hours since they escaped, and though they were no longer in immediate danger, the feeling of unease still lingered. The twins, Lyra and Zara, were in the back of the ship, silently discussing their next move. Jake couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation, and it made his stomach turn. "There's no safe place anymore." Zara's voice was tense. "They'll keep coming after us, no matter where we go." Lyra's tone was calm, but there was a hardness to it that Jake had come to recognize. "We've always known this day would come. We've been running for years." Jake's heart ached as he listened to their words. He had gotten to know Lyra and Zara, and despite everything that had happened, they were still standing strong. But he could hear the weariness in their voices, the weight of endless escape. They had been through so much, and he was right there with them now. His mind kept circling back to the betrayal. The man they had trusted, who had led them to believe they had an ally, had turned on them. Jake had fought hard to protect them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed in some way. He had been so focused on the mission that he hadn't seen the treachery hiding right under their noses. The ship's warning system beeped, pulling Jake out of his thoughts. His eyes flicked to the monitor, and his heart sank. Another ship was closing in fast, too fast to be a coincidence. It was a stealth ship, hidden by advanced cloaking technology. It was the enemy. They had found them again. Jake's pulse quickened as he switched the ship to evasive maneuvers, trying to buy them some time. "Lyra, Zara," he shouted, his voice urgent. "Get to the weapons system. We've got company." Lyra and Zara rushed to the front of the ship, their faces hard with resolve. There was no hesitation in their movements. They had been preparing for this moment for so long, and now it had arrived. The enemy was here. "What do you want to do?" Zara asked, already working to target the incoming ship. Jake clenched his jaw. "We fight back. We can't outrun them." Lyra glanced at him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that spoke volumes. "If we fight, there's no turning back. We'll be marked for life." Jake knew what she meant. If they fought, there would be no hiding from their enemies anymore. They would be putting everything on the line. No more hiding in the shadows. But he wasn't about to let them be captured. Not after everything they had been through. "We don't have a choice," Jake said firmly. "We fight." The twin sisters moved quickly, their hands working with the precision of soldiers who had been trained for this very moment. The ship's weapons powered up, and they fired at the incoming vessel. The blast shook the ship, but the enemy ship didn't back down. It returned fire, and Jake had to steer the ship sharply to avoid the full force of the attack. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a few minutes. The enemy ship was powerful, but Jake and the twins were relentless. Finally, after a tense standoff, they succeeded. The enemy ship, heavily damaged, limped away, disappearing into the blackness of space. Jake sat back, breathing heavily, his heart still pounding from the adrenaline. They had won for now, but the price of loyalty was clear. They couldn't hide anymore. They had made themselves known, and the enemies hunting them would never stop. As he looked at the twins, standing side by side, Jake knew that they had crossed a point of no return. Their fight wasn't just about survival. It was about something bigger. And no matter how hard the road ahead became, Jake was ready to walk it with them. The stars outside the ship were a silent reminder of how far they had come and how much farther they still had to go. The tension from the battle had faded, but the weight of their journey remained. Jake sat in the cockpit, staring into the vast expanse of space, his hands resting on the controls. The silence inside the ship was heavy, broken only by the soft hum of the engines. Lyra and Zara were in the back, tending to the ship's systems. They were quiet, focused, their usual energy dampened by the battle they had just won. But Jake knew better than to ask them how they were feeling. He had learned that words were often unnecessary with the twins. They had their own way of coping with things, and he respected that. "We made it," Zara said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Jake turned his head, glancing at her. She stood in the doorway to the cockpit, her arms crossed over her chest. Her usual fiery energy was still there, but there was a softness to her now, something that hadn't been there before. Lyra appeared behind her, her calm presence filling the space. "For now," she added, her voice steady. "But there's more to come. We're not safe yet." Jake nodded, understanding what she meant. They had escaped the immediate threat, but the war they were in wasn't over. Their enemies wouldn't stop coming. But something had changed in him, something deep and unspoken. The trust they had built, the bond they shared, it was stronger than any external threat they could face. "We'll keep fighting," Jake said, his voice firm. "But we'll do it together. We don't have to face this alone." The twins looked at him, their expressions softening. Lyra gave him a small smile, one that spoke volumes. Zara's eyes held a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that made Jake's heart beat a little faster. They were more than just his clients now. They were his companions, his partners in this fight. And no matter what happened next, he would stand by them. "We've been running for so long," Lyra said quietly, her gaze focused on the stars outside. "But maybe it's time we stopped running. Maybe it's time we took a stand." Jake's heart skipped a beat. It was a small, simple statement, but it meant everything. The twins had always been on the defensive, always looking over their shoulders. But now, they were ready to fight for something more, to fight for a future, and Jake was ready to fight with them. Zara stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch Jake's shoulder. "We've been through a lot together, Jake, and I. I don't know what the future holds. But I do know this: you're not just our bodyguard anymore. You're part of our family." Jake's chest tightened at her words. Family. It was a word he hadn't used in years, not since the loss of his own. But now, as he looked at Lyra and Zara, he realized how true those words were. They had become his family in a way that nothing else could replace. "We'll face whatever comes," Jake said, his voice steady. Together. The ship soared through the stars, the unknown stretching out before them. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. As they drifted into the darkness of space, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of peace, a calm in the midst of the chaos. The battle wasn't over, but they had won something important. They had found each other. And that made all the difference.